I checked the last of my trap lines along the northern edge of my property, disappointment settling in as I found it empty. 3 days now without a single catch. The forest was playing games with me again. The morning air bit at my face as I knelt to reset the trap. My fingers worked from memory. 10 years of doing this had made the motions automatic. Dad would have said it was just bad luck, but 3 days of empty traps felt like more than chance. My property backed up against Algonquin Provincial Park, about as far from civilization as you could get in this part of Canada, which was exactly how I liked it. At 28, I'd spent most of my adult life out here, learning every trail and stream, every seasonal change in these woods. I tucked the trap back into place, covering it lightly with leaves. Not that it seemed to matter lately. Whatever was keeping the animals away, it wasn't my technique. Dad had taught me better than that. Animals know things we don't, he used to tell me. Robert Mitchell had been a man of few words but deep knowledge. Before he died in 2020, he'd passed on everything he knew about living off this land. The cabin, the property, the skills, all his legacy. I straightened up, my knees cracking. The path back to the cabin stretched about a mile through dense forest. The quiet didn't bother me. Never had. People talked too much anyway. Asked too many questions. Out here, the silence made sense. The forest spoke in its own way if you knew how to listen. The wind shifted through the pines, bringing with it the scent of coming snow. November in northern Ontario meant winter was settling in for the long haul. I'd need to split more firewood before the week was out. I was maybe halfway back to the cabin when I heard it, a soft pain sound coming from somewhere off the trail. I stopped, listening. There it was again. A whimper, weak but distinct. My first thought was a wounded fox, maybe caught in someone else's trap who'd been careless enough to set lines on my property. I followed the sound, pushing through a dense thicket of spruce. The branches scratched at my face and caught on my jacket. What I found wasn't a fox. A dog lay curled on its side, its reddish-brown fur matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Each breath it took seemed to require enormous effort. Its eyes, half open and clouded with pain, tracked my movement, but it made no attempt to run or even raise its head. "Hey there," I said, my voice sounding strange after days of not speaking to anyone. The dog's ear twitched slightly, the only sign it heard me. I crouched down, keeping my movements slow. The dog was small to medium-sized, but it was hard to tell its proper weight. Its ribs pressed against its skin like bars, and its coat hung on its frame. Starving, from the look of it. A hunting dog, maybe? Lost during deer season? We got a few hunters up this way, though none had permission to cross my land. I moved closer, and that's when I saw the wound on its hind leg. Angry red, swollen, with yellow-green pus visible even from where I knelt. That kind of infection could kill an animal quick. "You're in rough shape," I said. The dog's eyes met mine, and something in them made my chest tighten. I'd never had a pet, not even growing up. Dad wasn't the type for animals unless we were hunting them. But this creature's silent suffering hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I should leave it, I thought. Nature taking its course and all that. Dad would have said the same. But I couldn't. Not with those eyes looking at me. "All right," I sighed. "Let's see what we can do." I slipped off my jacket and laid it on the ground. When I reached to pick up the dog, it made no move to bite or resist, too far gone for that. Its body felt impossibly light as I lifted it onto the jacket, bones and not much else. I wrapped the fabric around it gently, creating a makeshift sling. The walk back to the cabin took twice as long with my bundle. The dog made little noise beyond the occasional whimper when I jostled it too much. I tried to keep my pace steady, aware that each step might be causing it pain. My cabin came into view, a simple structure my father had built 30 years ago. Single story, sturdy logs, a metal roof that rang like bells during heavy rain. Smoke curled from the chimney. I'd banked the fire before heading out that morning. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately. I crossed to the old couch and carefully set down my bundle, unwrapping the jacket to examine the dog more closely. In the better light, it looked even worse. The wound on its leg was badly infected, the kind that turned deadly if left untreated. I'd seen similar infections in game animals, ones that had escaped with injuries and later died from the poison in their blood. I filled a basin with warm water from the kettle on the stove and found the first aid kit Dad had always kept stocked. Hunting accidents happened, and out here you had to be your own doctor. The dog watched me with wary eyes as I approached with the basin and supplies. "This isn't going to feel great," I told it, not knowing if talking to the animal made any sense, but feeling the need to say something anyway. "But it needs cleaning." I dampened a clean cloth and gently pressed it to the wound. The dog flinched but didn't try to bite or run. It simply laid its head down and endured. I cleaned away the worst of the dirt and pus, trying to be thorough without causing unnecessary pain. The antiseptic would hurt, I knew that. When I poured some onto a fresh cloth and touched it to the wound, the dog let out a high, thin sound that made me wince. "Sorry, but it has to be done," I murmured. "Infection like this will kill you otherwise." I bandaged the leg as best I could, using gauze and medical tape from the kit. Not perfect, but it would have to do. The dog needed food, water, and rest, though I wasn't sure it would survive even with those. I filled a shallow bowl with water and placed it near the dog's head. It lifted itself just enough to lap weakly at the liquid. Good sign, I thought. Still has some fight left. Food was trickier. I had venison from my last successful hunt, but the dog needed something easy to digest. I cut small pieces of meat and boiled them in water until they broke down into a broth. Once it had cooled, I offered a spoonful to the dog. It sniffed once, then lapped it up with surprising energy. "Hungry, huh?" I said, offering another spoonful. "Take it slow. Too much at once might make you sick." The dog ate what I gave it, then laid its head back down on the blanket I'd placed under it. Its breathing seemed less labored now, but I knew better than to get too optimistic. Animals this far gone often rallied briefly before the end. Night fell, and I added wood to the stove, keeping the cabin warmer than I usually would. The dog slept, its body occasionally twitching with dreams or pain. I couldn't tell which. I sat in my chair by the stove, watching the rise and fall of its side. Strange to have another living thing in the cabin after so long alone. Stranger still to care whether it lived or died. Dad would probably laugh at me. "It's just a dog, James," he'd say. "Probably belongs to someone who didn't take proper care of it." But looking at the sleeping animal, I couldn't bring myself to agree with my imagined father. Lost or abandoned, it deserved a chance. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the wind picking up outside. Tomorrow I'd check my traps again, hoping for better luck. For now, I had a patient to watch over, this unexpected visitor who'd broken 4 years of perfect solitude. I woke before dawn to the sound of labored breathing from the couch. The dog was still alive. That alone surprised me. Its condition had seemed beyond saving when I'd found it yesterday. In the pale light filtering through the cabin windows, I checked on my unexpected guest. The bandage on its leg needed changing, already soaked through with yellow discharge from the infection. The dog's eyes tracked me as I moved around the cabin, alert despite its weakness. "Let's take a look at that leg," I said, kneeling beside the couch. The dog didn't resist as I unwrapped the soiled bandage. The wound looked angry and red, but some of yesterday's swelling had gone down. A good sign, though infection that deep would take time to heal if it healed at all. I cleaned the wound again, applied more antiseptic, and rebandaged it with fresh gauze. Throughout the process, the dog remained still, only flinching slightly when I touched the most sensitive areas. "You need a name," I said, more to fill the silence than anything else. The dog's reddish-brown coat, though dull from malnutrition and neglect, reminded me of iron left out in the rain. "How about Rusty? That work for you?" The dog, Rusty, blinked slowly, which I took as agreement. I prepared another batch of venison broth, this time adding small pieces of meat. Rusty ate with more enthusiasm than the previous night, lapping up every drop and looking for more. Easy, I cautioned, giving him water instead. Too much too fast will make you sick. The rest of that day established what would become our routine for the next several days. Every few hours, I fed Rusty small portions of broth and meat, gradually increasing the amount as his strength returned. Twice daily, I changed his bandages and cleaned his wound, noting with satisfaction as the swelling continued to decrease and healthy tissue began to form. By the second day, Rusty attempted to stand when I approached the couch. His legs trembled with the effort, but there was determination in the set of his jaw. "Whoa, take it slow," I said, gently easing him back down. "You're nowhere near ready for that." But Rusty had other ideas. Later that afternoon, I returned from chopping wood to find him on the floor beside the couch, looking equal parts proud and exhausted from the effort. "Stubborn, aren't you?" I said, unable to keep the approval from my voice. Stubbornness kept things alive out here when the odds were against them. On the third day, Rusty managed to follow me from the couch to the kitchen, his gait uneven but determined. His injured leg barely touched the ground, but he'd figured out how to balance on the other three. I noticed he stayed close, rarely more than a few feet away from me as I moved around the cabin. His appetite improved daily. By the fourth morning, I transitioned him to mostly solid food. Chunks of venison and some dried fish I'd caught and preserved the previous summer. Rusty ate everything offered with increasing vigor, and I could already see his ribs becoming less prominent under his coat. That evening, as snow fell heavily outside, I sat in my chair by the stove with a book I'd read a dozen times before. Rusty lay on a blanket I'd placed near the heat, his eyes half closed but always opening when I turned a page or shifted in my seat. The wind howled around the cabin's corners, making the familiar sounds of a winter storm. Sounds I'd listened to alone for years. "Been a while since anyone else was here for winter," I told him. "Just me, since Dad died. 4 years now." Rusty lifted his head at the sound of my voice, ears perked forward. "He would have said I was crazy for bringing you in," I continued, unsure why I was talking so much after years of near silence. Wasting resources on a stray when winter's coming on. But he'd have done the same thing, I think. Just wouldn't have admitted it. By the fifth day, Rusty's personality began emerging from beneath the pain and exhaustion. He had a way of tilting his head when confused that made him look almost human in his expressiveness. When I said his name, his ears would prick up immediately, and his tail, still thin but gaining strength, would thump against the floor. The infection in his leg was finally retreating, pink, healthy tissue replacing the angry red and yellow of before. He could put some weight on it now, though he still favored it considerably. His coat had begun to shine with proper nutrition, revealing the true depth of its russet color that had inspired his name. That night, as I prepared dinner, venison stew, enough for us both, I realized how quickly I'd adjusted to having another presence in the cabin. The silence between us felt comfortable rather than empty. I'd lived alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it was like to share space with another living thing. I looked over at Rusty, who watched me from his blanket with attentive eyes. "You've made yourself at home pretty quick," I said. He thumped his tail in response. On the sixth morning, I woke to find Rusty standing by the cabin door, tail wagging tentatively. When he saw me watching, he looked pointedly at the door, then back at me. "Need to go out?" I asked, pulling on my boots. But when I opened the door, Rusty didn't just step outside to relieve himself as he had on previous days. Instead, he stood at the edge of the porch, looking back at me expectantly. The morning was clear and cold, the kind that made your lungs ache with each breath. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, covering my footprints from the previous day's wood gathering. Perfect tracking conditions. "You want to come check the snares with me?" I asked. It seemed impossible that he understood, but Rusty's tail wagged more vigorously. I considered the state of his leg. The wound was healing well, but a long trek through snow might set back his recovery. On the other hand, keeping an active dog confined too long carried its own risks. All right, I decided, but we'll keep it short, just the close ones. I gathered my gear, knife, small pack with water and basic supplies, and pulled on my heavier winter coat. Rusty waited patiently by the door, seeming to understand we were going somewhere together. The nearest snare line was about half a mile east of the cabin, running along a creek that rabbits used as a natural pathway through the forest. Rusty followed me down the trail, limping but determined. I kept my pace slow, watching to make sure he wasn't struggling too much. What struck me most was his silence. Most dogs I'd encountered on rare trips to town would bark at squirrels or birds, chasing everything that moved. Rusty moved through the forest like a natural hunter, quiet and focused. His eyes scanned the trees and underbrush constantly, and his ears swiveled to catch every sound. We approached the first snare, which sat empty. I reset it and continued to the next. Rusty stayed close, watching my movements with interest. The second and third snares were also empty. As we walked toward the fourth location, Rusty suddenly changed direction, heading about 20 yards off the trail. He stopped and looked back at me, clearly wanting me to follow. "What is it?" I asked, changing course to join him. Rusty led me to a spot where I'd set a snare weeks ago and subsequently forgotten. To my surprise, a snowshoe hare hung suspended in the wire loop, its white winter coat almost invisible against the snow. I would have walked right past it if not for Rusty. "Well done," I said, genuinely impressed. I knelt to collect the hare, quickly dispatching it and placing it in my pack. Rusty watched the process with patient interest, but made no move to take the hare for himself. As we continued checking the remaining snares, I observed Rusty more carefully. His movements, despite the limp, had purpose and training behind them. The way he kept downwind of potential game, his careful foot placement to minimize noise, his patient observation before moving forward, all spoke of a dog that had been taught to hunt. "Someone trained you well," I said as we headed back toward the cabin. "Wonder how you ended up lost out here." Rusty had no answer, of course, but I found myself grateful for whatever circumstances had brought him to my woods. For years I'd hunted alone, relying only on my own senses and knowledge. Having a partner with Rusty's exceptional nose and instincts would change things. Back at the cabin, I prepared the hare, giving Rusty the heart and liver as a reward for his help. He ate them carefully, not greedily, and then settled on his blanket to clean his paws. As I worked on skinning the hare, I glanced over at him. "You and I might make a good team," I said. Rusty thumped his tail against the floor, his eyes never leaving my hands as they worked. I'd always valued silence and patience in the woods, the two qualities that separated successful hunters from those who went home empty-handed. It seemed I'd found a companion who understood those principles as well as I did. 3 weeks had passed since Rusty had first shown his hunting skills with the forgotten snare. He now moved through the forest with growing confidence, his injured leg almost fully healed. The slight limp remained, but it didn't slow him down much anymore. In that time, we'd fallen into a comfortable routine together. Each morning, we'd head out to check the trap lines, Rusty leading the way with his nose to the ground, often finding game I would have missed. The cabin felt different with him there, less empty. I talked more in those 3 weeks than I had in the previous year, even if my only audience was a dog. Rusty listened attentively to everything I said, his head tilted to one side, eyes fixed on mine as if he understood every word. Today, we were checking the lines near Canoe Lake, about 4 miles northeast of the cabin. The late autumn air carried the first real bite of winter, and patches of frost clung to the shadowed areas of the forest floor. Our breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Rusty trotted a few yards ahead of me, occasionally stopping to sniff at something interesting before moving on. The hunting had been good lately. With Rusty's help, We'd caught more rabbits in the past 3 weeks than I'd managed in the previous 2 months alone. He had an uncanny ability to sense where animals had recently passed, leading me to spots I might never have thought to set traps. It made me wonder what kind of training he'd received before I found him. Someone had taught him well. "Hold up," I called softly as we approached the lake. "Let's check the western line first." Rusty turned obediently and changed direction, heading along the western shore of Canoe Lake. I followed, watching his movements. He'd become more than just a companion. He was a partner now, making my solitary life in the woods not quite so solitary anymore. We'd checked 3 trap sites and collected 2 rabbits when Rusty's behavior suddenly changed. He stopped dead in his tracks about 50 yards from the next clearing. His entire body went rigid, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. The fur along his spine rose in a sharp ridge. I stopped too, instantly alert. In 3 weeks of hunting together, I'd never seen him act like this. Rusty was typically calm and focused, moving through the forest with purpose, but without aggression. This was different. Something had triggered a primal response in him. "What is it, boy?" I asked quietly, moving up beside him. Rusty didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on something ahead through a stand of birch trees. The growl continued, low and steady. When I took a step forward, he backed up slightly, still growling. I scanned the forest ahead, looking for whatever had triggered his reaction. A bear, maybe? Wolves? But Rusty's behavior seemed wrong for either of those threats. This wasn't just alertness or even fear of a predator. It was something else. Something that made the dog deeply uneasy. Following his gaze, I moved forward cautiously, pushing through the white trunks of the birch trees. Rusty stayed where he was, whining now as I moved away from him. As I stepped through the last of the birches, I entered a small clearing and stopped short. There in the center of the open space stood what I can only describe as a monolith. It was massive, easily 12 feet tall and about 4 feet wide, a perfect rectangle of what looked like polished black stone. The surface was impossibly smooth, with no visible seams or marks. Despite the afternoon sun streaming through the trees, the black surface reflected nothing, seeming to absorb the light that fell upon it. I stood motionless, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knew these woods. I'd hunted this area for years, walked every game trail and mapped every landmark within 10 miles of my cabin. This clearing had always been empty except for tall grass and wildflowers in summer, snow in winter. This monolith had never been here before. It couldn't have been. I glanced back at Rusty, who remained at the edge of the birch stand, refusing to enter the clearing. His growl had subsided, but now he whined anxiously, taking another step backward when I motioned for him to join me. Turning back to the monolith, I approached it carefully. The ground around the structure was undisturbed. No tire tracks, no signs of equipment or machinery that would have been needed to transport and erect something so massive. The grass bent slightly away from the monolith, as if pushed by a gentle wind, though the air in the clearing was completely still. That stillness was what struck me next. The forest around us had gone silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered, no insects buzzed. Even the constant background rustle of leaves in the wind had ceased within the clearing, though I could still hear it in the surrounding forest. I stopped about 10 feet from the structure. Up close, the surface was even stranger. A black so deep it seemed to go beyond mere color, as if looking into a hole cut straight through reality. I had an irrational urge to touch it, to see if my hand would pass through that perfect blackness, but something kept me from reaching out. "What the hell is this thing?" I said aloud, my voice sounding flat and muffled in the still air. Rusty's whine grew more insistent. I looked back to see him pacing at the edge of the clearing, clearly distressed by my proximity to the monolith. I circled the structure slowly, keeping my distance. It was the same on all sides, a perfect rectangle of absolute blackness. No markings, no seams, no foundation visible at its base. It simply stood there as if it had grown from the earth itself. But that was impossible. I'd been in this clearing less than 2 weeks ago. There had been nothing here then. I tried to make sense of it. Some kind of art installation, maybe. But who would drag something this size so deep into the woods, and why? A government project. But there were no access roads nearby large enough for the equipment needed to move something this size. And why was there no disturbance to the ground? No matter how careful someone might be, transporting and erecting a 12-foot monolith would leave marks. Soil compression, damaged vegetation, something. But the grass and soil around the base looked completely untouched. I backed away slowly, a crawling sensation working its way up my spine. Something about this thing felt fundamentally wrong. It didn't belong here in this natural setting. Its presence seemed to distort the very air around it, creating that pocket of unnatural stillness. Rusty barked once, sharply, when I was about halfway back to the tree line. His message was clear. Let's go. For once, I didn't argue with him. I retreated to where he waited, noticing how he pressed against my leg once I reached him, as if seeking reassurance. Together, we backed away from the clearing, neither of us willing to turn our backs on the monolith until it was out of sight behind the birch trees. Only then did Rusty relax slightly, though he kept looking over his shoulder as we made our way back toward the trap line. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned as we put distance between ourselves and the clearing. Birds calling, leaves rustling, the small movements of unseen animals in the underbrush. I tried to make sense of what we'd found. In all my years in these woods, I'd never encountered anything so out of place, so impossible to explain. The monolith's sudden appearance, with no signs of how it got there, defied all logical explanation. As we continued checking the remaining traps, my mind kept returning to the black structure standing silent in the clearing. What was it? How had it appeared overnight in a place I knew so well? And what had caused Rusty, a dog who faced down coyotes without flinching, to react with such obvious fear? I needed answers, but I wasn't sure where to find them. One thing was certain. The monolith shouldn't be there. Couldn't be there. Yet, somehow, it was. I drove my old truck along the winding road toward Huntsville, the steering wheel cold under my fingers, despite the heater that rattled and wheezed with each bump. The late afternoon sun hung low through the trees, casting long shadows across the pavement. The 40-minute drive gave me plenty of time to question myself about what I'd seen in the clearing. The black structure stood out in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. Its perfect smoothness, the way it seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it, how it stood in that clearing with no visible means of having been transported there. I'd spent my entire adult life in those woods. The monolith hadn't been there 2 weeks ago when I'd passed through hunting rabbits with Rusty. I'd left Rusty at the cabin, not wanting him to get worked up around strangers. He hadn't seemed happy about it, watching me from the porch steps with those attentive eyes, until I rounded the bend in my driveway and lost sight of him. The RCMP detachment in Huntsville was a small one-story building set back from the main road. I parked my truck in the nearly empty lot and sat for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts. How exactly do you explain something like this without sounding crazy? Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the already sterile room feel even more unwelcoming. A middle-aged woman at the front desk looked up as I entered. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need to report something unusual I found on my property," I said. She nodded and picked up a phone. "Constable Young will be with you in a moment." I sat on one of the hard plastic chairs, my hands resting on my knees. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. 5 minutes passed before a door opened and a man in RCMP uniform stepped out. "I'm Constable David Young," he said, extending his hand. "You wanted to report something?" I stood and shook his hand. "James Mitchell. I own property that borders Algonquin Park, about 40 minutes north of here. He nodded and gestured toward a small room off to the side. Let's talk in here. The interview room was plain, with a table, 4 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. Young took out a notebook and pen, setting them on the table between us. So, what seems to be the problem, Mr. Mitchell? I took a deep breath. I found something strange in the woods on my property yesterday. A large black structure, like a monument or something, standing in a clearing near Canoe Lake. Young raised an eyebrow. A structure? What kind of structure exactly? It's about 12 feet tall, 4 feet wide. A perfect rectangle, black, completely smooth surface. Like polished stone, but not like any stone I've ever seen. He wrote something in his notebook. And this structure is on your property? Yes. In a clearing I've walked through hundreds of times. It wasn't there 2 weeks ago. Young looked up from his notes. Are you certain about that? Sometimes we overlook things that have been there all along. The implication that I might have somehow missed a 12-foot monolith in my own woods made my jaw tighten. I'm certain. I know every inch of my land. This thing appeared out of nowhere. Appeared, he repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of that choice of words. And you have no idea what it might be? None. That's why I'm here. Young tapped his pen against the notebook. Could it be some kind of art installation? We get reports sometimes of people leaving unusual objects in the park. In Algonquin Park, maybe. Not on private property 5 miles from the nearest access road. What about a geological survey marker? The Ministry of Natural Resources sometimes places equipment in remote areas. I shook my head. No government agency would put something that size in that location without heavy equipment. There are no tire tracks, no signs of construction. The ground around it is completely undisturbed. Young wrote something else down, his expression growing more skeptical with each note. So, you're saying this large stone monument appeared on your property overnight, with no signs of how it got there? That's exactly what I'm saying. He closed his notebook. Mr. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but without more information, there's not much we can do. It sounds like someone may have placed an object on your land, which isn't necessarily a criminal matter unless they've damaged your property or threatened you in some way. Constable Young, something 12 feet tall and weighing probably several tons, doesn't just appear in the middle of the woods without leaving tracks. Whatever this thing is, it shouldn't be there, and I can't explain how it got there. Young leaned back in his chair. How long have you lived out there, Mr. Mitchell? All my life. The property was my father's before me. And you live alone? I could see where this was going. Yes. What does that have to do with anything? Living in isolation can sometimes affect a person's perception. When was the last time you were in town before today? My hands curled into fists under the table. About 3 weeks ago for supplies. My isolation has nothing to do with this. I'm telling you, there's something in those woods that doesn't belong there, and I can't explain how it got there. Young sighed, making a show of patience that only increased my frustration. Here's what I can do. I'll make a note of your report, and when resources permit, we'll send someone out to take a look. When resources permit. There's something out there right now that... Mr. Mitchell, he cut me off. We have limited personnel and multiple active cases. Based on what you've told me, this doesn't sound like an emergency situation. If you discover any evidence of trespassing or illegal activity, please don't hesitate to call us immediately. I stood up, knowing there was no point in continuing. Young clearly thought I was either lying or delusional. Fine, make your note. He stood as well, offering his hand again. We appreciate you bringing this to our attention. We'll look into it as soon as possible. I didn't shake his hand this time. Instead, I turned and walked out of the interview room, through the reception area, and back to my truck. The drive home was spent in angry silence, Reviewing the conversation and thinking of all the things I should have said. Darkness had fallen by the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to my cabin. The headlights caught the reflection of Rusty's eyes as he waited on the porch. Instead of greeting me with his usual quiet enthusiasm, Rusty paced back and forth along the edge of the porch, head low, movements stiff. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, climbing the steps. He came to me briefly, pressing against my legs, but then resumed his pacing, stopping occasionally to stare into the darkness beyond the cabin. I followed his gaze but saw nothing in the tree line. Inside, I lit the kerosene lamps and built up the fire in the stove. Rusty followed me in but wouldn't settle. He moved from window to window, his nails clicking on the wooden floor as he peered out into the night. Every few minutes, he would stop and listen, ears pricked forward, body tense. I tried to ignore his behavior as I heated up some leftover stew for dinner, but his anxiety was contagious. I found myself pausing to listen too, straining to hear whatever had him so alert. The forest outside sounded normal to me, the occasional rustle of wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the small sounds of the cabin settling. After eating, I sat in my chair by the stove with a book, hoping to distract myself from both Rusty's unease and my frustrating meeting with Constable Young. But Rusty's constant movement made it hard to concentrate. His agitation had only increased as the evening wore on. "There's nothing out there," I told him, but he ignored me, continuing his circuit of the windows. Around 11, I gave up on reading and decided to turn in. Maybe Rusty would calm down once the lights were out. I banked the fire in the stove, checked that the doors were locked, and went to my bedroom. Rusty followed me but remained standing in the doorway, his attention focused back toward the main room of the cabin. "Come on." I patted the foot of the bed where he usually slept. "Time to rest." He looked at me, then back toward the main room, clearly torn. Finally, he came in and jumped onto the bed. But instead of curling up to sleep, he sat upright, staring at the bedroom door. I lay down and closed my eyes, exhausted from the day's events. The image of the black monolith kept appearing in my mind, its impossible smoothness, its perfect geometric shape so out of place in the natural disorder of the forest. And beneath that image, a nagging sense that I had missed something important, some detail that would explain its presence. I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to find Rusty no longer on the bed. The cabin was dark except for the faint red glow from the banked coals in the stove. I heard a scratching sound from the main room and sat up, listening. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine. I got up and made my way through the darkness to the main room. Rusty stood at the front door, pawing at the wood, his whole body tense with urgency. "You need to go out?" I asked, reaching for my boots by the door. Rusty whined again, more insistent this time. I pulled on my boots and jacket, then opened the door. The night air hit me with its cold bite. Rusty shot past me, down the porch steps and into the yard. I expected him to head for the trees at the edge of the clearing to relieve himself, but instead, he ran to the center of the yard and stood facing the northern tree line. Then he began to bark, sharp, urgent barks that cut through the night air like gunshots. There was a quality to his barking I'd never heard before, something between warning and fear. I stepped off the porch, straining to see what had triggered this response. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the edge of the trees about 50 yards from the cabin, but I could make out nothing unusual there. "Rusty, come back," I called. He ignored me completely, continuing to bark at whatever he saw or sensed in the darkness. I took a few steps toward him, the frosted grass crunching under my boots. "Rusty, come here!" Still no response. His barking grew more frantic, and he took a few steps toward the tree line, then back again, as if torn between confronting what was there and staying near me. I looked more carefully at the trees where his attention was focused. The shadows between the trunks seemed deeper than they should have been, more solid somehow. But no matter how hard I stared, I couldn't see anything moving or out of place. Rusty, now! I tried once more. He continued barking, his voice echoing through the stillness of the night, warning against something I couldn't see. I woke to a gray dawn light filtering through the cabin windows. After several nights of broken sleep, exhaustion had finally claimed me for a few hours. Rusty lay curled at the foot of the bed, his eyes already open and watching me. The frantic barking from the previous night seemed like a distant memory in the cold light of morning, but the tension in Rusty's body told me he hadn't forgotten whatever had spooked him. "Ready to check the traps?" I asked, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. His ears perked up at the familiar words, but he didn't show his usual enthusiasm. Instead, he followed me closely as I dressed and prepared for our morning routine, staying within arm's reach at all times. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, we headed out into the brisk morning air. Frost coated the grass and crunched under my boots as we crossed the yard. Rusty stayed unusually close, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The first trap line was only a quarter-mile from the cabin, following a small creek where rabbits frequently traveled. As we approached the first set, I already knew something was wrong. Normally, Rusty would race ahead to each trap location, eager to see what we'd caught. Today, he stayed by my side, his movements stiff and alert. The first trap was empty, which wasn't unusual by itself, but as I knelt to examine it, I noticed fresh rabbit tracks in the soft earth around the trap. Multiple sets showing recent activity. The trap was undisturbed, set exactly as I'd left it. "That's odd," I muttered. Rusty whined softly beside me. The second trap told the same story, empty, but surrounded by fresh tracks, and the third, and the fourth. By the time we checked the entire first line, I knew we were facing something beyond bad luck. Every single trap was empty, yet animal signs were abundant. Tracks of rabbits, squirrels, and even a fox crossed through the area, sometimes passing within inches of the traps without triggering them. We moved on to the second line, set along the eastern edge of my property. The results were identical, empty traps surrounded by fresh tracks. Animals had clearly been active in the area, but somehow they'd all avoided my carefully placed sets. I crouched beside the last trap, running my fingers over the mechanism to ensure it was working properly. Everything seemed fine. The trigger was sensitive, the spring taut, the placement perfect. There was no reason every animal in the forest should suddenly be able to avoid it. "This doesn't make sense," I said to Rusty, who sat watching me with concerned eyes. "In 15 years, I've never seen anything like this." Back at the cabin, I cooked us both a lunch of leftover venison from our previous week's hunting. As Rusty ate, I pulled out my logbook and noted the strange pattern of empty traps and abundant tracks. Maybe it was a fluke, a strange day when the animals were especially wary. But it wasn't a fluke. Over the next 5 days, the pattern repeated itself with maddening consistency. Each morning, we'd check the traps to find them empty despite clear evidence that animals had been active nearby. My freezer supplies began to dwindle, and my confusion turned to frustration. On the third morning, I decided to check on the monolith again. Rusty seemed reluctant as we approached the clearing near Canoe Lake, his pace slowing and his body tensing the closer we got. The black structure stood exactly as before, tall and impossible in the morning light. But something had changed in the surrounding forest. As we drew near the clearing, I realized what it was. Silence. Complete and unnatural silence. Normally, the woods were filled with sound, the rustling of leaves, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the buzz of insects. Now, nothing. It was as if someone had thrown a switch, cutting off all the background noise of the living forest. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, listening intently. Not a single bird call, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to die away as it approached the open space around the monolith. Rusty pressed against my leg, his eyes fixed on the black structure. A low whine escaped him, and he kept looking back over his shoulder toward the way we had come. "What is it, boy?" I asked quietly. He didn't respond except to press harder against me. His behavior was becoming increasingly concerning. The nervous glances, the constant checking behind us, as if he sensed something following that I couldn't see or hear. I studied the monolith from where we stood. It remained unchanged, its black surface absorbing the morning light. The ground around it showed no disturbance, no signs of any activity. Yet somehow I felt certain this thing was connected to the empty traps and the fleeing wildlife. "Let's go," I said to Rusty, who needed no encouragement to leave. As we walked back toward the cabin, the forest sounds gradually returned. A distant woodpecker, the rustle of wind through branches, the small movements of unseen creatures. But these sounds seemed muted somehow, diminished, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. On the fourth day of empty traps, I made a decision over my morning coffee. "We need to find out where the animals have gone," I told Rusty, who sat watching me from beside the stove. "If they're avoiding our usual areas, we need to go where they've moved to." Rusty tilted his head, seeming to understand my intent, if not my exact words. After checking the empty traps one more time, we struck north toward the Algonquin Park boundary. I knew the area well, having hunted and trapped there for years before the park expanded its borders. If the animals had relocated, that direction offered the most extensive wilderness for them to inhabit. We followed a game trail that had once been reliable for deer and smaller game. The trail was still visible, winding between the trees, but showed little recent use. The few tracks we found were old, at least several days, with edges softened by weather. "This doesn't make sense," I said, kneeling to examine a set of deer prints that had been partially filled with fallen pine needles. They had to go somewhere. We pushed on, moving from one familiar hunting ground to another. Each location told the same story. Old signs of animal activity, but nothing recent. It was as if all the wildlife had simply picked up and moved somewhere else, leaving behind only traces of their previous presence. By midday, we'd covered several miles and found nothing promising. The forest felt wrong in a way that was hard to define. Too quiet, too still. Even in winter, these woods should have been alive with activity. Birds flitting between branches, squirrels gathering the last of the fall nuts, the occasional glimpse of larger animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, we walked through what felt like a museum diorama of a forest, all the right elements in place but lacking the spark of actual life. Rusty stayed unusually close throughout our search, often looking back the way we had come. His behavior reminded me of the night before when he'd barked at something invisible in the darkness. Whatever had spooked him then seemed to be lingering in his mind, making him jumpy and alert. We continued north until we reached a small stream that marked the boundary of my property. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, but the banks showed none of the tracks that should have been there. No signs of animals coming to drink, no prints in the soft mud at the water's edge. "I don't understand this," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet forest. "Where did they all go?" Rusty whined softly, his ears constantly moving, tracking sounds I couldn't hear. We turned east, following the stream for nearly a mile before cutting south again through a stand of old-growth maple trees. This had always been a good area for hunting, the mature trees producing acorns that attracted deer and smaller game. Now it stood empty and silent, the forest floor undisturbed except for our own passing. As we moved back toward more familiar territory, I noticed Rusty's behavior becoming more erratic. He would stop suddenly, staring into the trees with his hackles raised, then hurry to catch up with me, often looking behind as if expecting to see something following us. "What is it, boy?" I asked during one such pause. "What do you see?" He gave no answer except to press against my leg before moving on, his body tense and alert. By late afternoon, we'd completed a wide loop north of the cabin. without finding any significant signs of recent animal activity. The forest had become a desert despite its abundant vegetation and water sources. It made no sense from any natural perspective I understood. As we approached the cabin from the north, I found myself looking in the direction of the monolith clearing, though it was miles away and hidden by trees. An idea had been forming in my mind throughout our fruitless search, a connection that seemed impossible yet increasingly difficult to ignore. The monolith had appeared suddenly in a clearing I knew well. Shortly after its appearance, all wildlife began avoiding my traps. The forest around the structure had fallen silent, devoid of the normal sounds of birds and small animals. And now we discovered that wildlife seemed to have abandoned a significant area of the forest surrounding the monolith's location. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Somehow, that black structure was driving away the local wildlife, creating an expanding zone of emptiness in the forest. But how could an inanimate object, even one as strange and unexplainable as the monolith, affect animal behavior over such a wide area? Inside the cabin, I pulled out my maps of the region and spread them across the table. Using a pencil, I marked the location of the monolith and then added notes about where we'd found the forest particularly quiet or devoid of animal signs. A pattern emerged as I worked. The areas most affected seemed to radiate outward from the monolith in a rough circle. The further from the structure, the more normal the forest seemed to be, though even at the farthest points of our search, wildlife activity had been notably diminished. Rusty sat beside me, watching as I worked. Unlike his usual relaxed posture in the cabin, he remained alert, his head occasionally turning toward the windows as if tracking something outside. His anxiety was feeding my own unease, creating a feedback loop of tension that filled the small cabin. "What is that thing?" I asked, not expecting an answer. "What's it doing to the forest?" Rusty whined softly, pressing his warm body against my leg. I stared at the map, trying to make sense of what was happening. In all my years living in these woods, I'd never encountered anything that couldn't eventually be explained by natural processes. Unusual weather patterns, disease outbreaks among certain species, human activity from the park, all these things could temporarily affect wildlife behavior. But this was different. The appearance of the monolith and the subsequent changes in the forest defied any natural explanation I could think of. Its perfect geometric shape, its sudden appearance without signs of transport or construction, and now its apparent effect on the surrounding ecosystem, none of it made sense. As darkness fell, I lit the kerosene lamps and stoked the fire in the stove. The familiar routine brought little comfort as my mind continued to circle around the problem of the monolith. Outside, the forest had fallen into its nighttime silence, but even that seemed wrong somehow. Too complete, too empty of the usual nocturnal sounds. Rusty refused to settle, moving restlessly from window to window just as he had the previous night. His behavior added to my growing sense that something fundamental had changed in the forest I'd called home for most of my life. Something that had begun with the appearance of that impossible black structure, standing silent in a clearing that should have been empty. 2 days had passed since my fruitless search of the forest. The maps I'd marked still lay on the kitchen table, a visual reminder of the unnatural emptiness spreading outward from the monolith. I'd checked the traps again that morning, still empty, still surrounded by an unnerving absence of wildlife. The pattern was beyond anything I could explain through natural causes or bad luck. Rusty had changed too. The dog who once moved through the forest with confidence now flinched at shadows and pressed against my leg at the slightest noise. His behavior had grown increasingly erratic with each passing hour, as if something invisible to me was constantly demanding his attention. That morning, as I made coffee, Rusty had spent 20 minutes scratching at the eastern wall of the cabin, whining and occasionally looking back at me as if expecting me to understand what troubled him. When I approached to check the wall, he'd backed away, hackles raised, before returning to continue his frantic scratching once I stepped aside. "There's nothing there, boy," I told him, running my hand over the rough wooden planks. The wall was solid, unchanged since my father had built it decades ago. Rusty disagreed. Something about that particular section of wall deeply disturbed him, though I could detect nothing unusual. By midday, his restlessness had only intensified. He refused to venture more than a few yards from me when we stepped outside to gather more firewood. The confidence that had marked his movements through the forest was gone, replaced by a nervous vigilance that kept his head constantly swiveling, ears pricked forward, then flattened against his skull in rapid succession. Most concerning were the moments when he would suddenly freeze, growling at empty spaces between trees or vacant patches of underbrush. His eyes would track something moving, following its progress with unwavering attention, though I could see nothing there but winter-dead leaves and bare branches. "What do you see?" I asked after the third such incident, kneeling beside him as he growled at a perfectly ordinary stand of birch trees. He gave no indication he'd heard me, his focus entirely on whatever phantom had captured his attention. Only when I gently touched his back did he startle and look at me, eyes wide with what I could only interpret as fear. Back inside the cabin, I tried to distract us both with routine tasks, cleaning my hunting rifles, organizing supplies, checking my dwindling food stores. Rusty remained unusually clingy, following so close behind me that I nearly tripped over him several times. Whenever I sat down, he pressed against my legs, his body vibrating with tension. By late afternoon, I'd given up on getting anything productive done. Rusty's anxiety had infected me, leaving my nerves raw and my attention fractured. I found myself pausing in the middle of simple tasks, listening for something I couldn't identify. The silence outside the cabin seemed to press against the windows like a physical force. As the early winter twilight descended, I began preparing dinner, a simple stew made from the last of my stored venison and dried vegetables. The familiar routine offered some comfort, and for a brief period, Rusty seemed to relax slightly, lying near the stove where the heat was strongest. I was just adding salt to the pot when it happened. Rusty exploded from his resting place, launching himself toward the kitchen window with a ferocity that knocked over a chair in his path. His barking was different from anything I'd heard before, not the alert bark of a hunting dog or even the warning bark from nights earlier. This was frantic, desperate, filled with a primal fear that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I abandoned the stew and moved quickly to the window, peering out into the dim twilight. The small clearing around the cabin lay empty and still, the trees at its edge dark silhouettes against the fading light. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. "What is it?" I asked, pressing my face closer to the glass. "I don't see anything, Rusty." He continued barking, his front paws now up on the windowsill, body rigid with tension. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the tree line, something I couldn't perceive no matter how hard I strained my vision. I grabbed my rifle from its place by the door, more from habit than any clear intention. The weight of it in my hands offered little reassurance as Rusty's barking grew even more frantic. I considered stepping outside to investigate but hesitated. Something about Rusty's reaction suggested that whatever was out there was better observed from behind the cabin walls. For several minutes, this standoff continued, Rusty barking frantically at the window, me standing beside him with my rifle, both of us staring out at an apparently empty clearing. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Rusty stopped barking. The silence that followed felt louder than his previous noise. He backed away from the window, tail tucked between his legs, and scrambled under the kitchen table. There, he curled into a tight ball, his entire body trembling so violently that I could hear his nails clicking against the floor. I knelt beside the table. "Rusty, what's wrong, boy?" He raised his head slightly, eyes meeting mine, and the raw fear I saw there sent a chill through me. Whatever had frightened him was real, at least to him, and no amount of reassurance from me would convince him otherwise. The stew on the stove began to boil over, breaking the moment. I returned to the kitchen, moving the pot off the heat before looking once more out the window. The clearing remained empty, now fully embraced by night. I lit more kerosene lamps, their warm glow pushing back the darkness, but doing little to dispel the sense of wrongness that had settled over the cabin. Rusty refused to come out from under the table, even when I set a bowl of stew near him. He remained curled in a tight ball, eyes wide and watchful, tracking something I couldn't see as it apparently moved around the cabin. After eating my own dinner with little appetite, I checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The night promised to be a long one, with Rusty in his current state and my own nerves frayed by the day's events. I tried to read for a while, an old paperback I'd read many times before, but the words refused to hold meaning. My attention kept drifting to Rusty under the table and to the window where he'd seen, or sensed, something in the darkness. Eventually, I banked the fire in the stove and prepared for bed, though I had little expectation of actual sleep. Rusty followed me to the bedroom, still staying unnaturally close, and jumped onto the bed without waiting for an invitation. He positioned himself against my legs, his body still trembling slightly. The cabin creaked and settled around us as the temperature outside continued to drop. Familiar sounds that had never bothered me before now seemed loaded with potential meaning. I found myself listening too intently to each small noise, trying to determine if it was normal or something else. I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep because I woke suddenly, completely alert. Rusty was pressed hard against my legs, his body rigid. In the darkness, I could feel him shaking. Then I heard it, a low humming sound, barely audible, coming from somewhere to the northeast, the direction of the monolith. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears to capture the sound. It wasn't mechanical like an engine or generator. The pitch fluctuated subtly, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate but not quite recognizable. The sound seemed to bypass my ears entirely, vibrating directly through the wooden walls of the cabin and into my bones. The longer I listened, the more certain I became that the source was the black structure standing in that clearing. The sound matched the wrongness I'd felt when standing before it, something that didn't belong in this world. Rusty whined softly beside me, his trembling increasing as the humming continued. I placed a hand on his side, feeling his rapid heartbeat through his ribs. He pressed closer, seeking comfort I wasn't sure I could provide. The humming maintained its steady presence for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. I lay motionless the entire time, one hand on Rusty, the other gripping the edge of my blanket so tightly my fingers cramped. When the sound finally began to fade, the relief was short-lived. Its absence left a vacuum that seemed even more disturbing, a waiting silence that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. The forest outside remained unnaturally quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Rusty didn't relax even after the humming disappeared completely. He remained alert beside me, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through the bedroom window. Occasionally, his ears would twitch toward a sound I couldn't hear, and a fresh tremor would run through his body. I lay awake until the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the window. The long night had yielded no answers, only more questions. What was the monolith? What was happening to the forest? And most immediately concerning, what had Rusty seen at the window that had terrified him so completely? The forest outside stayed completely silent as morning arrived, the normal dawn chorus of birds conspicuously absent. The silence itself had become a presence, a constant reminder that something fundamental had changed in the world outside my cabin walls. The evening settled around the cabin like a shroud, darkness pressing against the windows while I sat at the kitchen table cleaning my rifle. I'd been maintaining my weapons with extra care lately, though they'd seen little use with the absence of game. The familiar routine of disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling the rifle gave my hands something to do while my mind circled endlessly around the problem of the monolith. Rusty lay near the stove, his head on his paws but eyes wide open. He hadn't truly relaxed in days. Even now, his ears twitched at every small sound. His body tensed, as if ready to spring up at a moment's notice. "We'll figure this out," I told him, though I had no idea how. The words were more for my benefit than his. I finished reassembling my rifle and set it aside, stretching my back as I stood. The day had yielded no answers, only more questions that gnawed at my thoughts. I was halfway to the kitchen when it started, the humming sound from the previous night, but louder now, more insistent. It began as a low vibration that I felt more than heard, rattling the dishes in the cupboard and sending a shiver up my spine. Rusty was on his feet instantly, hackles raised. He ran to the door, then back to me, then to the door again, whining with increasing desperation. His nails clicked frantically against the wooden floor as he circled the cabin, pausing occasionally to stare at me with an urgency I couldn't ignore. "What is it, boy?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well what had him so agitated. The humming grew stronger by the second, no longer the subtle sound from last night, but a persistent drone that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. Rusty pawed at the door, looking back at me with pleading eyes. He wanted out. More than that. He wanted me to go with him. "You want to check it out?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "That doesn't seem like a good idea." His whining increased, taking on a quality I'd never heard before, something between fear and determination. He scratched at the door again, then ran back to press against my legs before returning to the door. The humming continued to build, now accompanied by a faint vibration I could feel through the soles of my boots. Whatever was happening out there, it was getting worse. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I made my decision. "Okay, let's go see." I grabbed my flashlight from the hook by the door and picked up my freshly cleaned rifle. The familiar weight offered little comfort as I pulled on my heavy coat and unlaced my boots. Rusty's agitation grew with each passing second, his body quivering with barely contained energy. When I finally opened the door, he shot past me into the yard but stopped about 20 feet away, looking back to make sure I was following. The night air bit at my face, cold and crisp. The stars overhead looked unusually bright against the black sky, but my attention was immediately drawn to the northeast, toward the monolith clearing. Even from miles away, I could see a faint red glow on the horizon, pulsing in time with the humming that now filled the air completely. The sound no longer seemed to come from a specific direction, but from everywhere at once, as if the forest itself was vibrating. "Jesus," I whispered, the word forming a small cloud in the cold air. Rusty barked once sharply, then took off toward the trees at the edge of my property. He stopped again, looking back, clearly wanting me to follow. "This is a bad idea," I said to no one in particular, as I tightened my grip on the rifle and followed Rusty into the trees. The forest was darker than it should have been, the shadows between trees seeming deeper and more substantial than normal. My flashlight carved a narrow path through the darkness, the beam looking weak and insufficient against the pressing night. Rusty stayed just at the edge of the light, his red-brown coat appearing almost black in the dim illumination. He led me along paths I knew well, though they seemed changed somehow, not in their physical layout, but in their feel. The familiar forest had become alien territory, each step taking us further from safety and closer to whatever awaited in that clearing. The humming grew louder as we walked, becoming a physical presence that pressed against my eardrums and made my teeth ache. I could feel it through my feet now, a steady vibration in the earth itself that increased with each step toward the monolith. Rusty stopped frequently to make sure I was still following, his eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight like twin yellow lamps in the darkness. Despite his obvious fear, he seemed determined to lead me toward the source of the disturbance. "Why are we going toward it?" I asked him during one such pause. "Most animals run away from danger, not toward it." He offered no answer except to continue forward, picking his way carefully through the underbrush with a caution I'd never seen in him before. His ears were flattened against his skull, his tail tucked low. But still, he pressed on. As we drew closer to the clearing, the red glow on the horizon intensified, pulsing like a heartbeat. The humming had transformed into a deep thrumming that vibrated through my entire body, making it difficult to think clearly. Rusty paused at the edge of the birch trees that marked the boundary of the clearing, turning to look at me one last time. The message in his eyes was clear enough. We shouldn't go any farther, but we had to see. I stepped through the last line of trees, Rusty reluctantly following, and what I saw froze me in place. The monolith stood at the center of the clearing just as before, but it was changed. The perfect black surface now pulsed with a deep red glow that seemed to come from within, casting an unnatural light across the open space. The light throbbed in perfect synchronization with the thrumming sound, growing brighter, then dimmer in a rhythm that felt almost organic. Rusty circled the clearing's edge, staying well back from the monolith itself, but unwilling to retreat into the trees. He moved with the caution of a wolf approaching an unfamiliar trap, each step deliberate and ready to reverse at the slightest provocation. I stood transfixed, my rifle forgotten in my hands as I watched the monolith pulse with that sickly red light. The thrumming had reached a pitch that made my skull vibrate, and I found myself gritting my teeth against the sensation. The air in the clearing felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Then I noticed the cracks. They appeared first at the base of the monolith, thin lines of deeper red against the pulsing surface. As I watched, they spread upward like veins, branching and connecting in patterns that reminded me of spider webs or lightning bolts. Within minutes, the entire surface was covered with a network of glowing red fissures that widened and narrowed with each pulse of light. "What the hell?" I whispered, taking an involuntary step backward. Rusty whined from somewhere behind me, the sound barely audible over the thrumming that now felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I wanted to run, to grab Rusty and retreat to the safety of the cabin, but I couldn't move. Some combination of fear and fascination kept me rooted to the spot as the cracks in the monolith continued to widen. The thrumming changed pitch suddenly, dropping to a lower frequency that I could feel in my chest cavity. The cracks in the monolith's surface widened further, and the red glow intensified until it hurt to look directly at it. The air around the structure seemed to distort, wavering like heat rising from hot pavement. Then I saw movement within the cracks, something pushing from the inside. Dark shapes pressed against the widening fissures, writhing and pulsating as they sought escape. The cracks stretched further, and I heard a sound like stone grinding against stone as the monolith's surface began to give way. I raised my rifle instinctively, training it on the widest crack near the center of the structure. My hands were steady despite the fear coursing through me, muscle memory taking over as I sighted down the barrel. But what was I aiming at? What could bullets do against something I couldn't even comprehend? The first shape pushed through, a dark, ropey tendril that writhed in the air like a snake seeking prey. It extended several feet from the crack before another followed, then another. The tendrils moved with purpose, reaching and exploring the air around them as more pushed through from inside. I kept my rifle raised but couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger. What would happen if I shot at those things? Would it make them retreat, or would it provoke them into some kind of attack? The rational part of my brain, the part not frozen in shock, recognized that this situation was beyond anything my hunting experience had prepared me for. More shapes squeezed through the widening cracks, their movements becoming more defined as they emerged. They were larger than I'd initially thought, each tendril as thick as my arm, and covered in a surface that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the red light. They moved in ways that defied natural movement, bending at impossible angles and stretching to lengths that seemed to grow with each passing second. Rusty growled from behind me, a deep sound that carried over even the thrumming of the monolith. I wanted to call him to my side, to grab him and run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening before me. The cracks had spread across the entire monolith now, and from every fissure, those dark, writhing shapes continued to emerge. The tendrils pushed farther through the cracks, revealing their true nature as they emerged fully into our world. They weren't just simple appendages, but parts of larger entities that defied description. Each mass consisted of dark, ropey tentacles surrounding openings that resembled faces or mouths. Within these openings, rows of needle-sharp teeth gleamed in the pulsing red light, clicking against each other as the creatures moved. I tried counting them as they spilled out. 1, 2, 3, but soon lost track as their numbers grew. At least a dozen separate beings spread throughout the clearing, maybe more. They moved across the ground like liquid shadows, their bodies seeming to flow rather than walk or crawl. A wet sliding noise accompanied their movement, the only sound they made beyond the continuous thrumming from the monolith. Beside me, Rusty pressed hard against my leg. His growl rumbled deep in his chest, constant but quiet, as if he knew better than to draw their attention with loud barking. His body trembled against mine, but he didn't run. Whether from loyalty or terror, he stayed rooted beside me. My finger rested on the trigger of my rifle, but I didn't fire. Some instinct told me that bullets would do nothing against these things, might even provoke them, so I stood frozen, watching as the creatures began to feed. The destruction started at the monolith and spread outward. Wherever the tentacles touched living plants, death followed instantly. Tall grass blackened and crumbled to ash under their touch. Small saplings withered, their green leaves curling and disintegrating in seconds. Even the largest trees weren't immune. When the creatures wrapped their appendages around trunks, the bark turned gray and flaked away, revealing dead wood beneath that soon collapsed into piles of ash. God, I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. The clearing transformed before my eyes. What had been a living space of grass, wildflowers, and trees became a wasteland of gray ash and blackened stumps. The creatures left trails behind them as they moved, marking their paths with death. The vibrant forest floor disappeared under a layer of fine powder that rose in small clouds with each new movement. I watched helplessly as the circle of destruction expanded. The creatures moved with purpose, some heading toward the edges of the clearing while others concentrated their feeding near the monolith. Nothing they touched survived. Even the moss and lichen on rocks died instantly, flaking away to nothing. One of the creatures changed direction, turning toward where Rusty and I stood at the clearing's edge. It moved faster than the others, its mass of tentacles flowing over the ground with terrible grace. I raised my rifle higher, though I still didn't fire. Rusty's growl intensified, and I felt his muscles bunch, as if preparing to attack or flee. The thing stopped about 10 feet away from us. In the red light, I could see its surface rippling with an oily sheen that caught the light in ways that hurt my eyes. Colors that shouldn't exist shifted across its dark skin, an iridescence that reminded me of oil on water, but somehow deeper, as if the colors existed in dimensions I couldn't properly perceive. What might have been its front portion raised slightly. A seam appeared in its mass, widening to reveal that mouth I'd glimpsed earlier. As it opened, a smell hit me with physical force. Rotting fish left in the sun for days, mixed with sulfur and something else I couldn't name, but that made my stomach twist with instinctive revulsion. I held my breath, certain it was about to lunge at us. My finger tightened on the trigger, despite my earlier hesitation. If it came closer, I would fire, regardless of whether bullets could harm it. But the creature paused. Its mouth-like opening faced directly toward us, but it made no move to advance. For several terrible seconds, we faced each other in a silent standoff, human, dog, and something that had no place in our world. Then it turned away, rejoining the others in their systematic destruction of the clearing. I exhaled slowly, my lungs burning from holding my breath. The devastation continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Time seemed to stretch and distort in the presence of these things, making it impossible to judge its normal passage. All I could do was watch as they transformed the once vibrant clearing into a wasteland. The red glow from the monolith provided the only light, casting long shadows that merged with the creatures themselves, until it became difficult to tell where shadow ended and creature began. Rusty stayed pressed against me, his growl never ceasing. I kept my rifle raised, though by now I knew with certainty that it would offer no protection if the creatures decided to attack us. We were witnessing something beyond human understanding, something that operated according to rules I couldn't comprehend. The thrumming from the monolith suddenly changed pitch again, rising to a frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The creatures responded immediately, all of them turning toward the structure as if hearing a call. The nearest one flowed back toward the monolith, its tentacles leaving fresh trails of ash in its wake. The others followed, abandoning their feeding to return to the structure. The creatures flowed back to the monolith like oil returning to its source. Their tentacles retracted into the cracks, pulling those horrific mouth openings in last. The red glow pulsed faster as they disappeared, each throb of light taking on a frantic quality. Within minutes, they had all vanished back into the structure, leaving only destruction in their wake. I didn't lower my rifle. Rusty didn't stop growling. We stood frozen at the edge of what had once been a clearing, but was now a perfect circle of death. "Stay," I whispered to Rusty, though he showed no inclination to move. The cracks in the monolith began to seal themselves, the red light fading from within as they closed. The thrumming sound diminished gradually, until the forest fell into an unnatural silence once more. The black surface returned to its original appearance, smooth, featureless, and absorbing all light that touched it. I didn't trust the calm. Neither did Rusty. We remained motionless for what must have been another hour, waiting for any sign that those things might return. My arms ached from holding the rifle ready, but I couldn't bring myself to lower it. Rusty stayed pressed against my leg, his body still tight with tension, eyes never leaving the monolith. When an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, the sound nearly made me pull the trigger from pure nerves. It was the first normal forest sound I'd heard since we'd arrived at the clearing, and somehow that made it safe to move again. "Let's check it out," I told Rusty, my voice sounding strange and thin in the quiet air. We approached cautiously, Rusty staying tight against my right leg. The destruction became more apparent with each step. What had been living forest floor was now a layer of fine gray ash that rose in small clouds around my boots. The perfect circle of death extended approximately 50 yards in every direction from the monolith, the boundary between life and devastation sharply defined. At the edge of the dead zone, I knelt and touched the ash with my free hand. It crumbled between my fingers, finer than any ash I'd seen from a forest fire, almost like talcum powder. It left a greasy residue on my skin that I immediately wanted to wipe away. The smell hit me then, decay and corruption that seemed too intense for the short time that had passed. It wasn't the sharp smell of fresh ash, but something deeper and more repulsive, like centuries of rot compressed into minutes. I pulled my hand back and wiped it against my pants leg, then stood and looked toward the monolith. It stood unchanged at the center of the destruction, showing no evidence of the cracks or the red glow that had emanated from within. No sign at all of the nightmare I'd just witnessed. "Time to go," I told Rusty, backing away from the circle. "We need to tell someone." Rusty needed no convincing. He turned and trotted toward home, looking back frequently to make sure I was following and that nothing was pursuing us. The walk back to the cabin seemed longer than the journey out. Every shadow between the trees looked deeper. Every rustle of leaves sounded threatening. I kept the flashlight beam moving constantly, scanning the forest around us for any sign of those creatures. Rusty stayed close, occasionally pressing against my leg as we walked. Back at the cabin, I didn't bother sleeping. What I'd seen had burned away any possibility of rest. Instead, I began gathering supplies: food, water, ammunition, first aid kit, warm clothes. I packed methodically, filling my old duffel bag and several plastic containers. Whatever those things were, I wasn't staying to find out if they'd come back. Rusty watched me pack, his eyes following my movements around the cabin. He seemed to understand we were leaving and showed no objection. If anything, he appeared relieved, waiting patiently by the door whenever I moved in that direction. "We'll go to the police at first light," I told him as I loaded the last of the supplies into boxes. "Make them listen this time." Throughout the night, I kept glancing toward the northeast, half expecting to see that red glow returning. The forest remained dark and quiet, but the memory of what I'd witnessed kept me wide awake and alert. When the first gray light of dawn appeared, I loaded everything into my truck. Rusty jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, settling himself with his nose pointed toward the road ahead. I took one last look at the cabin, wondering if I'd ever come back, then started the engine and headed for Huntsville. The RCMP detachment looked exactly as it had during my previous visit: small, official, and unwelcoming. I told Rusty to stay in the truck, promising to return quickly. He watched me walk away with worried eyes, but remained where I'd told him to stay. Inside, the same woman sat at the front desk. She recognized me immediately, her expression shifting from professional welcome to wary caution. "I need to speak with Constable Young," I said before she could speak. "It's an emergency." She hesitated only briefly before picking up her phone. A few minutes later, Young emerged from the back office, looking tired and irritated. His uniform was as crisp as before, but his eyes showed he wasn't pleased to see me again. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, gesturing toward the same interview room we'd used before. "What brings you back so soon?" I followed him into the room and began speaking before he could even sit down. I told him everything: the humming sound, the red glow, the cracks in the monolith, and the creatures that had emerged. I described how they had destroyed every living thing in the clearing, reducing it all to ash. My words tumbled out in a rush, and I could hear how crazy it all sounded, but I couldn't stop myself. Young's expression changed as I spoke, shifting from annoyed professionalism to open skepticism, and finally to something like pity. He didn't interrupt me, just let me talk until I ran out of words. "Mr. Mitchell," he said when I finally fell silent, "that's quite a story." "It's not a story," I insisted. "You need to send someone out there. Those things, whatever they were, they destroyed everything they touched. What if they come back? What if they spread beyond that clearing?" Young sighed and leaned back in his chair. "James, I want to help you. I really do. But what you're describing, it's not possible. I know what I saw." "I'm sure you believe that." His tone had changed, becoming gentler, the way someone might talk to a child or a confused elderly person. But stress and isolation can do strange things to a person's mind. "When was the last time you spoke to anyone besides me?" Heat rose in my face. "I'm not crazy. I didn't say you were. But living alone out there, especially after losing your father, it can affect a person, make them see things." "I didn't imagine this," I said, leaning forward. "There's a perfect circle of death in that clearing. Everything inside it has been reduced to ash. Go see for yourself." Young folded his hands on the table. "Even if there is some kind of dead vegetation in that clearing, there are plenty of natural explanations. Disease, lightning strikes, chemical contamination. But creatures coming out of a stone monolith? That's not something the RCMP can investigate." "Then who can?" I demanded. "Honestly, I think you should consider talking to someone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. There's a good doctor in town. He helps people who are dealing with stress, trauma, that sort of thing. I stared at the card but didn't take it. You think I need a psychiatrist? I think you've been alone too long, Young said carefully. And I think you're seeing threats that aren't there. It happens, especially to people who live in isolation. Will you at least send someone to look at the clearing? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Young sighed again. I can't justify allocating resources based on this account, Mr. Mitchell. I'm sorry. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. People need to know what's happening out there. Nothing is happening out there except in your mind, Young said, his voice hardening slightly. And I'm not filing an official report about monsters coming out of rocks. Now, I suggest you take this card and make an appointment. Dr. Brennan is very good. He can help you. I left the card on the table and walked out without another word. Rusty perked up when I returned to the truck, but his tail stopped wagging when he saw my expression. They won't help, I told him as I started the engine. We're on our own. The drive back to the cabin was silent except for the truck's engine and the occasional sigh from Rusty. I kept thinking about Young's face, about the pity I'd seen there. He truly believed I was hallucinating or having some kind of breakdown. And why wouldn't he? My story sounded insane even to my own ears. But I knew what I'd seen. Those creatures were real. The destruction they'd caused was real. And someone needed to do something about it before they returned. I pulled onto the dirt road leading to my property, my mind already planning what to do next. I'd need to document everything, take photographs of the dead circle, gather samples of the ash, record any changes in the monolith. With enough evidence, someone would have to listen. The cabin came into view, looking exactly as I'd left it that morning. I parked the truck and let Rusty out, watching as he immediately began sniffing around the yard, checking for any changes or intrusions. Let's go look at that clearing again, I told him. I need pictures. Rusty was reluctant, but followed as I grabbed my old digital camera from the cabin and headed northeast. The walk seemed to take forever, each step bringing a growing sense of dread. What would we find? Would the monolith still be there? Would those creatures have returned? When we reached the edge of the clearing, I stopped in shock. The circle of death remained, a perfect 50-yard diameter of gray ash where nothing lived. The boundary between destruction and normal forest was still sharply defined, as if drawn with a compass. The smell of decay hung in the air, perhaps even stronger than before. But the monolith was gone. Where it had stood was nothing but more ash, indistinguishable from the rest of the dead circle. No trace remained of the 12-foot black structure that had dominated the clearing just hours earlier. It had vanished completely, as if it had never existed at all. I walked forward in disbelief, Rusty following reluctantly behind me. I reached the center of the circle where the monolith had stood and knelt down, running my fingers through the ash. Nothing solid remained, no foundation or base that might have anchored the structure. Just ash, as fine and powdery as the rest of the circle. It's gone, I said aloud, though there was no one to hear but Rusty. How can it be gone? Rusty whined softly, pressing against my leg as I knelt there. His eyes scanned the clearing constantly, alert for any sign of danger. I took out my camera and began documenting the scene. The perfect circle, the uniform destruction, the sharp boundary between ash and living forest. The photos wouldn't show what had happened here, wouldn't capture those creatures or the red glow from the monolith, but they would at least prove that something had destroyed this section of forest in a way that defied natural explanation. As I photographed the clearing, a terrible realization settled over me. The monolith's disappearance didn't mean this was over. Whatever doorway had opened here might open again, somewhere else, bringing those creatures back to continue their destruction. The monolith might be gone, but the dead circle remained as evidence of what had happened, and what might happen again. 6 weeks passed since the monolith vanished, leaving behind only that perfect circle of death in the clearing. After discovering its disappearance, I had packed my truck with supplies, fully intending to leave this place behind. But something kept me here, some sense of responsibility I couldn't shake. If that thing returned, someone needed to know, someone needed to be watching. Spring had arrived in the forest according to the calendar, but you wouldn't know it by looking at that clearing. While the surrounding woods showed the first signs of new growth, tiny buds on tree branches, early wildflowers pushing through the leaf litter, the circle remained utterly barren. The gray ash hadn't changed, hadn't blown away in the wind, or washed away with the spring rains. It sat there like a scar on the landscape, a perfect 50-yard diameter of absolute death. I walked through the morning mist toward that clearing again, making what had become a daily pilgrimage. Rusty trotted a few paces ahead, but as we approached the dead zone, he slowed and fell back to my side. He'd gotten over the worst of his fear in the weeks since the creatures disappeared, but he still wouldn't set foot in that circle, and he stayed closer to me whenever we came near it. "Nothing new today," I told him as we reached the edge. "Just like yesterday." I stood at the boundary where living forest met dead ash, that impossibly sharp line that no natural phenomenon could explain. 6 weeks and not a single blade of grass had grown within the circle. Not one seed had taken root. The space remained as sterile as the day those things had fed on everything living. Rusty sat beside me, watching the circle with alert eyes. His ears twitched at every small sound from the forest behind us, but he seemed calmer than during those first days after the monolith vanished. Still cautious, still watchful, but no longer consumed by terror. After checking the perimeter for any changes, there were none. We headed back toward the cabin. I needed to reset my trap lines again, even though I knew they'd be empty when I checked them tomorrow. Nothing lived in these woods anymore, at least nothing bigger than insects. The squirrels, rabbits, foxes, and deer that had once made this forest their home had vanished along with the monolith, leaving behind a green shell that looked alive but felt empty. "Maybe we'll get lucky today," I said to Rusty as we approached the first trap location. He looked up at me, and I swore I saw doubt in his eyes. The trap sat exactly as I'd left it yesterday, set and ready, surrounded by undisturbed forest floor. No tracks, no signs of animals passing nearby. I reset it anyway, going through motions that had become meaningless ritual rather than productive work. All 27 traps told the same story: untouched mechanisms in an abandoned forest. My freezer stores had dwindled to almost nothing in the weeks since the wildlife disappeared. I'd driven into town twice for supplies, rationing carefully to make them last. If the animals didn't return soon, I'd need to consider alternatives for the long term. Back at the cabin, I added another entry to my journal, a thick notebook I'd started keeping the day after the monolith disappeared. The entry read much like the previous ones. No changes to the circle, no wildlife in the traps, no signs of the monolith returning. But I kept writing anyway, recording every detail I could remember about that night, trying to capture the creature's appearance, movements, and the sounds they made before my memory of them faded. The journal had become my proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd seen had been real. When doubt crept in, and it did, especially late at night when the cabin creaked and settled, I read through those pages to remind myself. I sat at the kitchen table, adding today's observations while Rusty dozed near the stove. My last trip to the police station in Huntsville had gone about as well as the first. I'd brought the photographs that time, spreading them across Constable Young's desk, images of the perfect circle, the sharp boundary between life and death, the unnatural uniformity of the destruction. Young had looked at them with mild interest, but no real concern. "Could be a lot of things," he'd said, sliding the photos back toward me. "Chemical spill, plant disease, maybe even a controlled burn that got out of hand." I'd pointed out the perfect circularity, the complete absence of regrowth despite ideal spring conditions, but he'd shrugged it off. "Nature does strange things sometimes," he'd said, "but there's always a rational explanation." His card for Dr. Brennan had appeared on the table again. I hadn't taken it that time either. The afternoon stretched ahead, empty like all the others. I checked my dwindling supplies and made a list for my next town run. Rusty watched me move around the cabin, his eyes following my movements with quiet attention. He'd become even more attuned to my moods in the weeks since the monolith, sensing my restlessness and uncertainty. "What do you think, boy?" I asked him as I sat beside him on the floor. "Are we wasting our time here?" He leaned against my side, solid and warm. I ran my hand over his coat, feeling the healthy muscle beneath. At least Rusty had fully recovered, both physically from his old leg injury and mentally from the terror of that night. He still had moments of alertness, times when his head would snap up and his ears would prick forward at some sound I couldn't hear. But the constant fear had faded. As evening approached, I made a simple dinner of canned beans and the last of my rice. Rusty got half a can of stew meat I'd been saving for a special occasion, though there wasn't much special about this particular night. We ate in the quiet cabin, with only the sounds of our movements and the occasional pop from the small fire I'd built to take the chill off the spring evening. After dinner, I took my usual spot by the window that faced northeast toward the clearing. Rusty settled at my feet as I flipped through a worn paperback, not really reading the words. Most nights followed this pattern now: quiet meals, half-hearted attempts at normal activities, and the constant awareness of what lay out there in the forest. That night, I woke suddenly, sitting straight up in bed. Rusty was already alert beside me, his body tense but not panicked. I listened, trying to identify what had pulled me from sleep. There it was, faint but unmistakable. The humming sound, the same low vibration that had preceded the monolith's opening. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, just as before, bypassing my ears to resonate directly in my bones. I threw off the blankets and grabbed my flashlight, pulling on boots without bothering to lace them. Rusty followed as I moved quickly through the cabin and out onto the porch. The night air felt cool against my face as I stood listening, trying to pinpoint the direction. The sound seemed different this time, fainter, less focused. It wavered in and out like a weak radio signal, present one moment and gone the next. I strained to hear it, turning slowly to check different directions, but the inconsistency made it impossible to locate. After 10 minutes, the humming faded completely, leaving behind only the normal night sounds of the forest. I stood on the porch for another half hour, waiting for it to return, but the night remained quiet. Back inside, I recorded the experience in my journal, noting the time, duration, and differences from the previous occurrences. This wasn't the first time I'd heard the humming since the monolith disappeared. Similar episodes had happened 3 times over the past 6 weeks. Each time, the sound had been fainter and briefer than before, never lasting long enough for me to track it to its source. I didn't sleep again that night. Instead, I sat by the window with my rifle across my lap, watching the dark trees until dawn broke over the forest. Rusty kept vigil with me, alert but calm, a steady presence in the uncertain darkness. The next morning, I headed straight for the clearing, moving quickly through the familiar forest with Rusty at my heels. Part of me expected, perhaps even hoped, to find the monolith standing there again, solid and real, and confirming that I hadn't imagined everything. But the clearing remained empty, the circle of ash unchanged, no sign of disturbance or return. I walked the entire perimeter, checking for any alterations to the perfect boundary. Nothing had changed. Whatever had caused that brief humming in the night, it hadn't affected the dead zone. I took more photographs with my old digital camera, comparing them mentally with previous images to confirm the lack of changes. Back at the cabin, I added these observations to my journal, then sat staring at the growing collection of entries. The early ones contained detailed descriptions of the monolith and creatures, written while the memories were still fresh. The more recent entries had become shorter, more routine, daily checks with nothing new to report, brief mentions of the occasional humming sounds, notes on the continued absence of wildlife. I flipped through the pages, reading random passages from those first days. My own words brought back vivid images of those creatures flowing out of the cracks, of the red glow pulsing from within the monolith, of the perfect circle of death they'd created. The memories remained sharp despite the passing weeks. My decision to stay had come gradually. The initial shock and fear had driven me to pack the truck, ready to flee, but with the monolith gone and the creatures vanished, urgency had faded. I'd unpacked slowly over that first week, telling myself I was just staying long enough to see if anything changed, to gather more evidence. But as days turned into weeks, I'd accepted the truth. I couldn't leave this place unmonitored. The forest had been my home for most of my life. My father had taught me its rhythms and patterns, had shown me how to live within its boundaries. Now something had broken those patterns, had corrupted the natural order in ways I still didn't understand. I couldn't walk away from that. So I stayed, watching and waiting. The waiting was the hardest part. The long hours of nothing happening, of checking empty traps and circling the barren clearing, of listening for sounds in the night that rarely came. The isolation pressed in more heavily than it ever had before, despite Rusty's constant companionship. That afternoon, I hiked to the farthest edge of my property, an area I rarely visited since it bordered public land. I wanted to see if wildlife might be returning at the periphery, gradually reclaiming territory from the outside in. Rusty seemed more animated during this walk, perhaps sensing my hope or simply enjoying the change in routine. The forest looked normal here, spring growth proceeding as it should. But the silence remained unnatural. No bird song, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. We found deer tracks near the property line, the first animal sign I'd seen in weeks, but they led away from my land rather than toward it. I knelt to examine the tracks, touching the slight impressions in the soft earth. At least they're still out there, I told Rusty. They just know better than to come here. On the walk back to the cabin, my thoughts turned to the future. How long would I continue this watch? Weeks? Months? Years? What if the monolith never returned? What if the forest never recovered? How long could I survive in a dead place? These questions had no good answers. All I knew was that I couldn't leave yet. Not while the humming sometimes returned in the night. Not while the dead circle remained as evidence of what had happened. Someone needed to be here if those things came back. Someone needed to remember what they'd done and what they might do again. That evening I sat on the porch as twilight settled over the forest. Rusty lay beside my chair, head on his paws but eyes alert. The spring air felt cool but not cold, carrying the scent of distant rain. In the growing darkness, I could almost pretend the forest was normal, that life continued as it always had beneath the canopy of trees. But the emptiness remained, a void I could feel more than see. The dead circle waited out there in the night, a doorway that had closed but might open again. And I would be here when it did, watching and remembering. Someone had to remember.